Statistics in RPG games are probably the most important feature. They define if your player is strong or is weak. They're often involved in the calculation of the damage and the damage reduction, but statistics can extend to many other pieces of the gameplay, many other concepts. So, for example, there are statistics that define how fast your player or an enemy moves, from how far an enemy can see you, or how much extra experience you gain, or your pickup radius, or your jump force. So many different aspects can be tuned in your gameplay with statistics. So it's important to have a solid and flexible control of the statistics, and the framework is actually providing you good tools to have a good control on statistics and have the flexibility and the modularity to actually implement and build the base for your game. In order to create a statistics, so we can right click on a folder on our assets, for example, go on create, go down to SOAP RPG framework, and you can find here stat. There is also the shortcut from the keyboard, Ctrl-Alt-S, if you want. And we can give a name to our statistics, so we could start, for example, with standard statistics for dealing damage. So, for example, we may want to define physical attack, and also Ctrl-Alt-S, for example, magic power, and we can also define critical chance, let's say, like this. But as I said, you may also want to define something like related to the capability of moving, so movement speed, and probably also the jump force. And we could also define statistics, for example, like reducing the damage that you are about to take. So, for example, the armor or the magical defense. And sometimes you also have something more exotic, like the pickup radius. And we could go on, but for now I think is kind of enough. So once you have defined the list of statistics for your game, for your entity, may it be your character or your enemy, sometimes they can share the same statistics, sometimes they can change, but we will talk a little more deep about this soon. But the next step you want to take is to create a stat set. So always on SOAP RPG framework we can find the stat set that is nothing more than a collection of statistics. It's like grouping your statistics together so that you can use this stat set in your entities later on, and I will show you soon how. But let's say that for example now we want to assign to our hero a stat set, so we call this hero stat set. And you see that here we have a field where we can assign the stats by pressing on add, and we can drag and drop statistics in there. So for example, we want to assign the physical attack, then we add, and we also put the magical defense, and we go on by adding all the statistics we just created. So now we have the stat set for our hero, and this is the simplest way to create a stat set. You just add stats to the stats list. But the stat set provides also another very powerful feature, that is the included stat set. And this is actually enhancing the modularity of the stat set so that you can include the statistics that are already defined in other stat sets. And you may wonder how could this be helpful, but so for the sake of example, let's consider the possibility that in our game, for example, we may have our hero that he can move, he can attack, so deal damage, he can also take damage, and he has kind of all the actions, all the possibilities. But there may be some enemies or some other entities that instead would like to not use some statistics. So for example, let's consider an enemy turret that is static, is not moving, and maybe you cannot even damage it. So such a turret would be interested only in statistics that deal damage, but not in statistics that reduce the damage, for example, magical defense and armor, and not even in the statistics that are used for moving an entity, for example, movement speed and jump force. So there are, like, you could come up with two solutions, like either you reuse this stat set and the turret will eventually not use the statistics that it is not interested into, but this is not the preferable solution, since you are adding statistics that will never use, adding complexity, confusion to the entity, to the turret. And another possibility would be also to create another stat set tailored for the turrets that includes only magical power and physical attack, for example, excluding all the other statistics that is not interested into. But also this is carrying with it the problem that if you then decide to also add, for example, the critical chance statistic to or any other statistic for the damage, you have to remember that you actually have to add the statistic both to the hero stat set and also to the turret stat set. So we are duplicating your statistics in two places, and you may forget to add to one or the other. So is here, in this case, that included stat sets are coming handy, as we may define partial stat sets. So, for example, we may want to create offensive, let's say, stat set that is defining all the statistics related to the damage. So, for example, physical attack and magical power and critical chance in this case. Then we may want to add another one. So we can also, with Ctrl D, we can duplicate one stat set. So we can click rename it. So for example, defensive stat set. And from here we can just erase and change. So for example, here we can add armor and magical defense, the statistics for reducing the damage. And we can also define a stat set for the entities that can move around the map. So for example, movement stat set. And here we're interested in putting movement speed and, for example, the jump force in this case. And now we have the possibility in our hero stat set, instead to just input all the statistics like this, we can get rid of them and include the stat set that we just added. So for example, our hero can deal damage, so we want to include the offensive stat set. And we can see that here stats included from the offensive stats that are physical attack, magical power, and critical chance. And since our hero will likely also take damage, we can also decorate him with the defensive stat set. And we said that we also would like our hero to move, and so we are also including the movement stat set. And so now the hero stat set is also taking into consideration all these statistics. And since our hero will be likely maybe the only entity that can level up in the game, we could also add some statistic, like for example, experience modifier. And at this point we can add to our hero stat set an explicit statistic included like this, because likely he will be the only one owning this. And this, so it makes sense to add on top of the included stats as something specific to our hero. So you still can use both of them, like include some with the included stats from the stat set, and also add statistics like in the old plain way. And this, so you can see, that is now allowing you to create stat set on the base of already existing stat set, increasing greatly the modularity and also protecting you so that if one day you decided to change the offensive statistics to include some, for example, armor penetration, you may want you have actually the possibility to go on the offensive stat, add, for example, here we could create a new armor penetration, and we add it here, and automatically our hero stat set, you can see that he will have the armor penetration included because he is dynamically using the offensive stat set. So this is protecting you from the case when you want to add one statistic to a stat set, but you are forget to adding it to other duplicated stat sets. Okay, this is enough talking about stat sets. Let's see where stat sets can be used into. So I prepared a little empty game object called player that is actually mimicking our player here, and the component we want to add is well, we need, as we saw in the entity video tutorial, the entity core. But if we go straight and look for entity stats, entity core will be taken as a dependency and added automatically to our entity. As you see here, we have entity core, and we have now also entity stats. So entity stats is the mono behavior that can be attached to an entity in order to control the statistics for such an entity, so that we can assign some values during the game, during the playtime, to such entity, and this component will manage them for it. We can see that we have, by default, use-based stats from classes like warrior, mage, rogue, and so on. But this, we will talk about statistics that are taken from classes in the classes and progression video tutorials. So for now, we can just uncheck this. And if we uncheck it, you see that now we have a fixed base stats set, because when we don't take dynamically the statistics from a class, we are actually we want to provide them with fixed values. So for example, here we can drag and drop the stat set of our hero. And if we do, you see that now we have all the statistics that are included in the stat set that we dragged and dropped. All the ones like experience modifier that we added explicitly, and also those that are carried by the included stat sets. And here we can assign some values for our player. These statistics are generally serialized on our player game object. So if now we enter in the playtime, he will start with these values that are serialized with the game object. Obviously, these values can be changed during the play mode during runtime. We can also apply modifiers for our statistics. There are various kind of modifiers like flat value modifiers or stat to stat modifiers, or also percentage modifiers, but we will be talking about them in the video tutorial about coding APIs. So for now, let's stick to the base values that our hero is starting with. And also we will be talking in the events video tutorial about the event that is being fired when any statistic changes during the playtime, during our game. There is actually a final option down here that is use cache for stats. I would suggest to not turn this on while you are making your game, as it makes the calculations of statistics more efficient, but also it adds complexity in debugging your game. So while you are making your game, just leave this off. It is easier to debug your game. And once you are switching to a production build, you may want to turn this on for extra performances. And this, I would say, is all for now for statistics. Obviously, we just scratched the surface. But we will be coming back for statistics also in the classes and progression video tutorial to talk more about how they can be retrieved dynamically from a class and how they can change and have a progression as our entity is leveling up.